I think it's an axiom that energy has changed quite a bit over the last 40 or 50 years, and journalism has changed quite a bit over the last 20 years, let's say. But energy journalism has also changed. And we're going to be talking to Shawn McCarthy, who's a veteran energy journalist based in Ottawa, about his life as an energy journalist. So, welcome to the interview, Shawn.
Thanks, Markham. I look forward to it, talking about myself.
Well, I've talked to you enough over the years that I know that it's an interesting story and I want to hear it. Now, let's start when you're moved from the United States to Canada. I gather you grew up in Pennsylvania and you went to Alberta, the University of Alberta, to go to university.
Yeah, so I did. I grew up in Philadelphia, and strange coincidences brought me to Alberta. I had a brother who actually went to Vietnam and ended up with an Australian wife, and her sister ended up strangely in Alberta. My brother visited Alberta and was raving about Calgary as being Denver North, and I was looking to go away to school, and Canada sounded different and interesting. And meanwhile, the sister-in-law moved up to Edmonton, and all those majestic mountains were nowhere to be found when I got to Edmonton. But there I was, and I did 4 years at the University of Alberta, and met my wife in my last year there, and we celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary, 41st wedding anniversary this fall. And I then went to Carleton and for journalism and did my master's, and then back to Alberta for where I started my career, including some coverage of the energy sector.
Well, let's talk about that because you and I are relatively the same vintage. And I remember back in the 70s working in Alberta, and it was very much an old style kind of oil patch and very, very different than today. So, what were things like back then? What kind of stories did you cover?
Well, it was boom time, definitely. McMurray was just getting going. It was being built as I was doing my undergrad. I actually lived for a year or so. We shared house with a couple of guys, and one of my roommates was commuting back and forth to Fort McMurray, and he was helping to build, I think, one of the first. I think the original plant would have been there by then, but this was probably the second one that was ever built up there. He would come back, pockets stuffed with money. Those poor students would be there, looking at Terry as a man who had really made it. He used to get mad at us when we drank his premium beer that was in the fridge. We told him not to put his premium beer in the fridge. That was the only way he could be sure that we would not drink it. And yeah, it was boom time, Alberta. I left in '79, came back in '81 with my wife, and we had about 3 months of boom, I think, left, and then it hit the wall. And I remember very clearly moving to Edmonton and signing a year's lease in 1980, early 1981, thinking I was lucky to get a place that I could sign a year's lease where they weren't going to raise the rent. And the prospect of raising rents just went out the window because the bottom fell out of the market, and the national energy program didn't help, and boom went bust for not the last time in the years that I covered that industry.
What were the stories and the people like in those days? I imagine that it was much more the swashbuckling wildcatter, entrepreneur of oil industry legend, as opposed to today. It's very corporate and dominated by engineers and accountants and so on. Is that a fair insight?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, I think that there were still a lot of, even today, there are a lot of entrepreneurs. I guess they're all lawyers and MBAs. I don't know. But there's still a lot of small businesses out there, guys trying to make a go of startup oil companies. The big players are all multinational, but they were then too. Imperial Oil was Exxon essentially, and it was the biggest player in the oil patch, and everybody loved Imperial Oil. There was certainly very little concern or opposition to the expansion of the oil industry, although I remember Lougheed, in fact, being careful and wanting to husband things a little bit, and especially the east slopes of the Rockies, which the current government is, for the first time I think since the Lougheed years, looking to open up for exploration and for coal production, coal mining. But yeah, Bob Blair was a character, Gallagher, who made such took advantage of the National Energy Program and built Dome Peak, and mostly in the Beaufort, because the federal government was requiring Canadian content in the Beaufort Sea, and everybody was very upbeat and optimistic about the Beaufort, which still sits up there undeveloped after all these years. But they were characters, and Bob Blair was a great character and very accessible and an interesting man. I worked with, I didn't get to move with the movers and shakers as a young journalist and student, but I worked with an awful lot of guys. I worked with guys who were from Devon, Alberta, and lived with guys who were from Devon and Kalmar, two towns outside of southwest of Edmonton. Kalmar was the old railroad town, guys. It was the working class, lower middle class town that the sort of railroad forgot, and Devon was the bedroom community of Imperial Oil. And Devon had all the amenities, the great rinks, the ski hill, all the amenities of 1970s Alberta, and Kalmar was a backwater. So you could see the impact that the oil industry had on those who participated in it. And it was, as I say, Alberta was in a boom for much of the 70s, and people, guys who and it's still the case and still a problem in Alberta, guys who might otherwise have gone on to get some sort of post-secondary degree were quitting high school and going out onto the rigs, and as I said, with my old friend Terry Pruno, making a lot of money. And if you're doing arts in undergraduate Alberta, they just sneered at you.
I'll bet they did, and they're not sneering today. So let's fast forward to your time as an energy reporter for the Toronto Star.
Right.
Was that late 90s?
So the Star would have been, no, that was late 80s. So I moved, I worked for Canadian Press for a few years in Toronto, and then jumped over to the Star. In fact, I covered, for Canadian Press, I covered the Amoco taking over Dome Petroleum, when Dome Petroleum was going broke in the late 80s. As a result of that bust that I talked about earlier, they just weren't surviving. And Amoco was a big American company, and went through a protracted deal to buy Dome Pete, and finally did. And I covered that for Canadian Press and broke a few stories in the Toronto Star. It was a real heyday for financial journalism. The Post had gone daily, Financial Post had gone daily. The Star had added a full business section, and I got hired on at the Star. So I covered the resource sector from Toronto, which in Toronto was more mining and more the refining side of the oil and gas sector, and the in fact the retail side of it than it was the exploration side. But they sent me back to Alberta, given my roots. They sent me back to Alberta a few times for some stories. I actually won an award from CAP for oil writing. I'm not sure that's something to be proud of, but there you go. Yeah, so it was a great time to be a financial journalist, and it was an interesting beat. And I did think that I had, in those days when Alberta was going through some tough years in the late 80s, I do think I had some awareness of where the industry had come from and what it was about, having spent a lot of years there, and that was helpful in the coverage for a Toronto audience.
Now, how has journalism changed from those days to the journalism that gets practiced now? And I mean, it's not that long ago you retired as an energy journalist for the Globe and Mail, so you still got your finger on the pulse.
Right.
What things are different?
I would say two really big changes. First of all, what's remained the same is that reporting and writing is, I mean, you're still a reporter. The reporting function hasn't changed that much. You're still going out after trying to break stories and hold people to account and so on, and cover the news. The pace has changed, with all the online. Even if you're at the Star or the Globe, you're still publishing your stories online probably first now, and that certainly, you don't have the leisure to report as much as you did before for the stories. It's a much faster pace. So that's a challenge, and sadly, I think, and the bigger change has been the loss of beat reporters. I was covering the energy sector for the Globe and Mail in a way that, you know, very few people were beat energy reporters anymore. I mean, outside of Alberta, surely very few. And I think that that's not just true for my beat, which was the energy, and not just oil and gas, but I covered energy, some of the electricity sector, and I had a bigger mandate. Climate change became an energy story. So that was a big issue, and is a big issue, that the journalists, who are very smart, very competent, I've taught at Carleton, and these bright kids coming out today, but they don't have often the background to come into a story and know, having covered it for a few years, where the best places to go for the facts, who might be snowing you, who's selling you a line, just the context. So I think that's missing, and that's harder for the journalists today to try and keep up with.
Yeah, I could probably count the number of energy journalists in Canada on the fingers of both hands, and have a few fingers left over. I mean,
And that's opened up an opportunity for you and for others that have come in and had startups and are filling that niche, frankly, because you're not going to go to the Globe or CBC and get that. There's a couple people around still, but you're not going to get that depth that you now bring to your publication, from the mainstream media.
yeah, and I see that as a real problem, because of course we're coming into a situation, a time when we really are this transitioning away from fossil fuels towards electricity, low carbon electricity. And at the very time when there's tumultuous change, there's not enough journalists to go around to really fully explain it to Canadians.
Yeah, I think that's right, and one reason I try to keep my hand in, is to fill that gap. I mean, probably another reason is I'm sitting around here in COVID lockdown, and I'd go crazy if I wasn't. But truly, I do feel, I have some experience that is still useful for in the media platforms, and I still find places that I can write and publish, and I enjoy doing it and keeping involved. But I think it is, and it's not just true in our beat, but it's true across the board, where you just don't have that depth of experience on a beat that you used to have. The poor reporters are being thrown into stories, without much background. It's not totally true. Some of the bigger ones, you can specialize a little bit, and CP has a very good energy environment reporter, and the Globe has a few now covering the beat. And certainly in Alberta, there's a lot of people who specialize in it. But generally speaking, I think that's true.
So just to wrap up, Shawn, if you were looking out, say, 2 to 5 years, any particular developments in energy and energy journalism that you think are on the way?
Oh man, buckle up, because the transition. I know people who don't even like the word transition anymore. Transformation of the economy, and not just fossil fuel sector, but the economy, is only going to gather pace. I mean, the Conservatives in Ottawa are talking about how can they have a net zero policy platform that is credible, and I think the days of trying to pretend this isn't happening are way, way beyond us, and it's just going to accelerate. And it has to. We're behind the curve in terms of reducing emissions to avert a really bad climate change outcome. So it really has to pick up pace, and Biden coming in and getting elected is one more fuel on the fire, adding more octane to it. I think any sector where carbon emissions are a factor in the production and consumption of energy is going to be hugely impacted over the next couple of years, and probably in ways that we can't predict. But the finance side of things, finally, the banks, the Canadian banks and pension funds are catching up to what's going on in Europe, and it's got just corporations are going to have more and more demands on them to account for how they're prepared to deal with the move to net zero world in a couple of decades. And that doesn't mean getting there. You have to net zero in a couple of decades means really dramatic changes in the relatively near term.
Shawn, thank you very much for this.
Mark, and thanks for the invitation.